I just finished watching the 7-part series called Queen's Gambit by Netflix. Really good stuff that I truly enjoyed, and I thought it would be a good idea to make a video so that people who do not necessarily have lots of experience playing chess tournaments might enjoy the very last game that Elizabeth Harmon played against Vasily Borgov in the very last episode, episode 7 of the series. So spoiler alert, if you haven't finished watching the series, keep in mind that I'm going to show the entire game now. So finish watching first and then come back to see what happened in that game. And this is not a masterclass, so I'm not going to go into an in-depth analysis. This is really just to show you the key points of the game so that you can enjoy and appreciate what was happening in that very last episode. So let's get started. In that game, Elizabeth had white pieces and she opened with the move d4. Black played d5, c4, and what a surprise, we now have Queen's Gambit. And by the way, in the series they used the descriptive notation a lot. So this would be pawn to queen 4, and then black plays pawn to queen 4 because that's the fourth square in front of the queen from the black's point of view, and then white plays pawn to queen's bishop 4. But I'm not going to use the descriptive notation. We all use algebraic notation these days, which is much simpler. So after the introductory moves d4, d5, c4, black decided to take, and now we have Queen's Gambit accepted. Elizabeth continued by putting the pawn on e4, and what was the point of giving away that pawn on c4? Well, in Queen's Gambit, you sort of temporarily give away a pawn, but you are trying to get a really great position in the middle of the board, in the center of the board. It's like boxing. Now, if you can push your opponent onto the ropes, and if you're controlling all of that space, then you are considerably better off. And the bishop is now attacking the pawn, and white has created this mighty central pawns right here on d4 and on e4. If black doesn't want to be significantly worse off, black will have to finish the development quickly and then undermine white's center. And black is indeed doing that with the next few moves. Black's next move was knight to c6, attacking the pawn on d4, and white replied with bishop e3, simply protecting the pawn. Knight to f6, attacking the e4 pawn, and white plays knight to c3. Good developing move and protecting that central pawn. Mind you, you wouldn't want to go e5, which would create an outpost for the black knight, and those pawns now are not very mobile, so that would go to black's advantage. Instead, it's much better to keep them next to each other, to keep the tension going, and to reinforce the center with knight to c3. Next, black played e5, attacking white center, and white continued with d5, grabbing some space on the queen side. Knight goes to e7, a very sensible move, because this knight will go to g6, and then black will be ready to start some operations on the king side to balance white's action on this part of the board. So it was d5, knight to e7, and then white gets the pawn back. Bishop takes c4. Borgov plays knight to g6, and white simply reinforces the center with f3. A very good move. Bishop d6 followed. Not bishop e7, because black wants to keep this diagonal open, having in mind that the principal field of action for black is the king side, and the queen might potentially come out and join the attack later on in the game. So bishop d6 was the next move, and then white played knight g to e2, or maybe it was queen d2. I can't really remember what was the exact move order, but it doesn't matter very much because by transposition we are going to arrive to the same position anyway. So let's go with knight g to e2 Next black's move was bishop d7, queen to d2, black goes a6, and white moves the bishop to b3 preemptively because black is going to play b5 and white doesn't want to have to move the bishop then. Black indeed goes b5 in this position, and white counters with a4. And I think I should stop for the moment and just explain the position a little bit. I have to say that I'm not really a great fan of this b5 move and the whole plan of bishop d7 and then playing b5. That's not enough for black to lose the game, of course, but I think it's just enough to give white some advantage. Why is this not the best possible plan in this position? Well, with every position, you have to keep in mind what's your principal field of action, whether you're better off in the center or on the king side or on the queen side. And in this position, we have an open c-file here. White has more space on the queen side. This bishop is pointing to the queen side. It's pretty obvious that because of this pawn on d5 and everything else, that it's white who has an advantage on the queen side. And therefore, black really should be looking for his chances on the opposite side of the board. Over there, we have two bishops, two knights, and the knights are short-range pieces. It's very hard to move them all the way back to the queen side if need be. There, on the king side, the two bishops are pointing at the king side. Potentially, the queen can join the attack as well. And therefore, black shouldn't waste lots of time playing on the queen side or weakening the position on the queen side. It would be much better to do something on this part of the board. Decent plan that I could suggest would be maybe going castles. Well, let me just show you that. And then either knight h5 to clear the path for this f-pawn, or maybe going h6, knight h7, opening the position with f5, opening the f-file, and then going for the king side attack to balance white's action on the queen side. And by the way, it is also worth noting that when you have two pawns that are next to each other, let's say you have two pawns that are next to each other like this, they can in a way protect each other. If this one is under attack, it can move forward and the other one is protecting it. If this one is under attack, it can move forward and the other one is attacking it. If one of those two pawns disappears, that makes the other one weaker because it becomes an isolated pawn. It is no longer possible to protect it with another pawn if need be. And so I consider b5 move here as a bit of a waste of time, but it's also a weakening move because the c7 pawn is now a little bit weaker. The square in front of it is a little bit weaker, so c6 can potentially be an outpost for one of the white's pieces. The c5 square is weakened because this pawn can't go backward and protect it. And a4 is a really good move because once those two pawns are swapped, it will be easier for white to attack this pawn than for black to see any benefits from having that pawn on b5. So a4, very good move. Black castles, white castles, and the world champion plays queen to e7. Rook c1, so here we are putting the rook a to c1, the rook is going on an open file. And black's next move was to play knight to h5. So finally, with a little bit of a delay due to bishop d7 and b5, black is starting a counterplay on this side of the board. g3, I quite like this move. There are two pieces that can potentially go on f4, and white is making sure that it is she who has the control over the f4 square. And then black played h6, gaining the control over g5. The next white's move, the next move that Elizabeth played was bishop to c2. very nice move because this bishop has nothing more to do on this particular diagonal, and the bishop is getting ready in the next few moves to swap off on b5 and then to swing to d3 and start putting pressure on this isolated pawn, on this pawn on b5 that is closest to white's position and easiest to attack. So this is the potential target for the attack. For now, white plays rook to a1. So having in mind that black has just left the a file, and so white is now trying to obtain control over the a file. Black goes back rook to a8 to challenge the a file. White goes bishop d3, and now the knight and the bishop are already putting the pressure on this pawn on b5. Black plays bishop b4, pinning the knight, making it impossible for white to take on b5. And this is the moment when Elizabeth swaps the rooks and gets out of the pin. Plays queen to c2. And again, we have the threat of taking on b5, in which case white would simply be a pawn up. Black decides to remain active, plays bishop to c5. It wouldn't be a good idea to swap those two bishops because then the queen would come to c5 with check, and the queen on c5 would be a very, very active piece. So Elizabeth plays knight to d1, protecting this bishop with her knight. And if the bishops are swapped, then this pawn becomes considerably weaker. We no longer have the bishop to protect it. Furthermore, this knight is now well positioned to go on f5 at some stage, and this rook can join the attack on an open file. Black would have too many weaknesses, the weak pawn on c7, the weak pawn on b5, and they would start falling one after another. So black plays a much better move and retreats with the bishop to d6. Simply protecting those pawns. But see, because of this rather unfortunate plan with bishop d7 and b5, black is very late with any counterplay on the king side. What's more, after this swap, the rook is not even on f-file, so playing f5 is not all that easy. White now plays knight to f2, just reinforcing the position, opening the file for the rook. And now black plays a really beautiful move, knight h to f4, offering to sacrifice this knight for the pawn. If that happens, then black would, well, the nature of the position would suddenly change because white would be a piece up for a pawn, but on the other hand, the g file opens, and with two bishops, the queen and the knight, black would have a very strong attack going on. Now, Elizabeth, who doesn't really like defending very much, she is an attacking player, likes playing very dynamic positions, but in which she is the one attacking. She plays rook to c1, and black plays queen to g5. So the queen is joining the attack, and now this pawn is pinned and cannot take the knight. White plays a sensible move, king to h1, unpinning, and now black plays queen to h5. At this stage, if you attempt to take the knight, that would be very much deadly, because if pawn takes, this pawn on f3 would fall, then the knight would jump on h4 with a deadly attack, because there is a queen to g2 checkmate. The only thing that you can try is some self-defense of the king by running king to f1, but then queen g2, king e1, knight f3 check, and very soon it would be the checkmate. It's really a winning attack for black, and so this pawn, this knight on f4 is untouchable. Instead, white has to take measures to protect this pawn on f3, which is what she does by putting the knight on g1. What followed now was knight takes on d3, because at this stage taking the knight became a real threat. So knight takes d3, knight takes d3, and finally black gets to play f5, gets to put this pawn on f5, which is something that black really should have played quite a number of moves ago. c5 square is weakened, the knight goes to c5, knight goes to c5, and the bishop retreats to c8. What white can do here is anticipate that those two pawns are going to be swapped off, and so the next move that Elizabeth played was rook to f1 in anticipation of pawn takes f-file opening, and in which case this would be a really, really good square for the rook. Okay, now the next move is the move that I very much like. It's knight to e7. And it's not immediately obvious what this knight is doing on e7, but if you look at the knight on g6, it really has no future. It can't go to f4, it can't go to h4, it's blocking the retreat path for the queen, if need be, and on g6 this knight has no future. But what black can do is anticipate what is going to happen next, that those two pawns are going to be swapped off, and that e4 is going to be white's main weakness. By the way, it is always easier to attack something that is closer to your position than to attack something that is far away. And so knight e7 is the introduction of a plan. Black will take on e4, swap those two pawns, move the king out of the way, put the knight on g8, then to f6, put the queen to g6, and start pressing against that main weakness in white's position. And okay, it does take a number of moves to come to completion with this particular plan, but it is much better than having no plan at all. At all times during the game, you have to try to find the very best pieces, the very best squares for each of your pieces. And so knight e7 is the introduction into that plan. Next, white played queen to d3, and so Borgov now has to consider that this b5 pawn, which has been weak for such a long time, is a significant weakness and has to start generating counterplay, otherwise he is simply going to lose a pawn. And I already told you that it is easier to attack something that is closer to your position than something that is far away. Now this pawn could have gone to b4, but then it's even closer to white's position, and it would be even easier for white to attack that pawn and to win it. So for the time being, black decides to keep it on b5, and what followed was the swap. Black took on e4, white took on e4, and black's next move was queen to g6. Pretty nice move, indirectly protecting the pawn on b5. If white were to take that pawn, then black would eliminate the defender of the e4 pawn. So queen b5, bishop takes c5, followed by queen e4, and black would have excellent position, probably a winning position actually. So it is more important for white to keep an eye on the e4 pawn and not lose that pawn. And with the next few moves, white is taking measures to activate all of the remaining pieces. Now this knight on g1 has finished its job. It protected the f3 pawn when it was necessary to protect it. But now this knight is very swiftly going into action. Knight f3. Black plays knight g8, so black is not really sitting idle. Black is completing his plan of putting the knight on f6 and pressuring against e4. What followed was knight to h4. And here you go, this knight managed to swing to f5. Now white has two knights that are on black's part of the board, on black's side of the board. Knight f6, and again we have the threat of black taking on c5 and then taking on e4, so that threat has been reinforced by bringing the knight on f6. White has to take measures, and h3 is a strong move. No time to take on c5. Queen needs to retreat. Queen went to g6, and at this stage the game was adjourned, or rather it was adjourned after h3, which means that black had to seal the move. Now, if I'm not mistaken, this is the move 36. So in the actual game, that wouldn't have happened because the adjournments would only happen after the move 40. And what used to be the case was that each player would have 2.5 hours for 40 moves. Then after 40 moves, they would adjourn the game and then spend the night analyzing it, or the good part of the afternoon analyzing the game. And when the game continues, that's when you have 1 hour for 16 moves. And for each subsequent 16 moves, you would get an extra hour of play. We no longer have adjournments, which is a really good thing because it was unfair back then when you could have your seconds analyze the game for you and come up with a complete analysis while you were having a rest. And it is even more unfair now when we have all of those very powerful chess engines that can analyze any position in a matter of seconds and come up with the best possible moves. So these days games are played through to the end. But back then, if the game went for too far, for over 40 moves, it was possible to adjourn it and then continue it the next day. And this is what is happening here in the series, in the last 7th episode of the series. After h3, black sealed his move, and the move that was sealed was queen to g6. And now Elizabeth plays a very nice move, knight to e6. It's worth noting that up until this moment, this was the actual game that was played between Vasily Ivanchuk, a very strong Ukrainian grandmaster, and Patrick Wolff. And it took place in the Interzonal tournament in Switzerland in 1993. The move that was played in the game by Ivanchuk was not knight to e6. He played g4 in this position, and they played a marathon game. It went on for 72 moves, ended in a draw in the end. Quite an amazing game. But Elizabeth played knight to e6. So this is really the moment when we go out of the game that was actually played, the game between Ivanchuk and Wolff. And the rest of the game has been constructed for the purpose of the series. However, it's such a beautiful game, and you have to say kudos to Netflix for doing it, because, you know, for crazy people like me who are likely to reconstruct the entire game, they went into effort of really providing us with an excellent experience and such an exciting game. So what happened after knight to e6? Black plays the best possible move, which is rook to a4, targeting this weak pawn on e4. And Elizabeth responds with the best move, really nice move, b3, forcing the rook to take on e4. Otherwise, black has no counterplay. It is, by the way, possible to take on g7, but this pawn is rather insignificant at this stage. Now, let's say if we take on g7, then the knight would take on e4, not the rook. And if we go back and close the diagonal, for example, then the next move would be a very strong knight to g3. You can't take the knight back because of a pin, and there are some very interesting tactical variations over there ending in a draw, but I'm not going to go into all of them. Let's just say that black does have significant counterplay if the knight takes on e4. And so this move is so beautiful because it forces the rook to go on e4. Rook takes e4. So Borgov takes on e4, and the next move was knight to d6. The knight cannot be recaptured, because if it is, then this knight would go to f8, forking the king and the queen. Black would lose the queen and the game. So this, instead of taking on d6, black has to take on e6 first, and that allows Elizabeth to create this beautiful passed pawn that causes black so many problems from this moment on. Pawn takes, queen can't take because the bishop is hanging, but this pawn, this passed pawn, is now free to move to e7, and it's only one move away from queening, from being converted into the queen. So black has to be very, very careful. Borgov plays a strong move, d5. This pawn is now protecting the rook. Otherwise, if black simply goes to f7 or to e8 to take that pawn, it would be deadly, because white simply takes on f6, removes the defender of the rook, and then the next move would be queen takes rook with an easy win. So black has to play d5, and now white gets to play bishop to c5, because d5 cleared the diagonal and made it possible for the bishop to go to c5 to protect this passed pawn over there. Black went queen e8, and the queen goes to f3, coming closer to join the attack on the king side. Black plays queen c6, and white simply plays b4, protecting that bishop. It was in this position when Borgov made a huge mistake and went back with the queen on e8. And it is true that in this position black doesn't really have active plans, but it was much better to go king g8 and keep the queen on a more active square, which would have allowed black to continue resisting in this position. Instead, queen e8 is the losing move, because it allows white to go to f5 with check, leaving black with two choices. Either to go to g8, in which case queen e6 check, followed by rook takes f6, leads to a winning position, or what happened in the game, to go to h8. But now we have that beautiful combination that Elizabeth spotted, which is to sacrifice the queen for the knight, to eliminate the main defender of the position, that knight on f6, and after rook takes on f6, it is not possible to stop rook going to f8. This rook, which is surrounded by the pawns, cannot really join the defense. It would be so good if black would sacrifice the rook for this pawn and the bishop, but that's not possible, and so rook f8 can't be stopped. What Borgov tried to do was to force some sort of a perpetual check, because that's his only chance in this position. But what followed was rook f8 check, king g7, and now the pawn went to e8 and was promoted into the queen. Well, because black is about to be checkmated, the only thing that black can do is to try to force some sort of a perpetual. So it was check. Sorry, the bishop didn't go to f2. Instead, king went to f1, attacking the rook. And because black is about to be checkmated and the endgame would be hopeless, Borgov decided to sacrifice this rook and go with queen g2 check, trying to create some sort of a perpetual with queen e4. But unfortunately for him, after queen e4 check, king d2, there are no more checks, and black is left in a hopeless position, running out of material and about to be checkmated. So in this position, black resigned. I hope that you enjoyed this game as much as I did. Thank you for watching.